There comes a time when a man rides not to chase fortune or flee justice, but simply to outrun the silence in his own heart. The dust curled up slow behind Silas Mercer's horse, like smoke rising from a fire that had long gone cold. Cinder Valley stretched out before him, an open wound of sun-baked soil and brittle grass, hemmed in by hills the color of old bruises. In the saddle, his shoulders sloped beneath the weight of quiet things, regrets unspoken, names of the dead he carried like smooth stones in a pocket. The road narrowed into wagon ruts by the time he reached the iron gate, its rusted bars twisted into the name Cinder Valley Ranch, though the letters sagged like the tired bones of a name forgotten too long. His mare, a dusty roan with half a right ear and an attitude to match, pawed at the ground and snorted once, uneasy. The wind picked up a little, sliding through the cottonwoods like it had a message too shy to speak. Silas paused there, just outside the gate, and ran his thumb across the edge of a silver dollar tucked deep in his coat. The coin had lived longer than some men he'd known. His father's voice rose up out of the dust of memory. "You'll know what's worth fighting for when the time comes, but you might not like how it tells you." Silas clicked his tongue, and the mare stepped forward. The ranch unfurled in a state of quiet collapse. Fences leaned like drunkards at a sermon. A weather vane on the barn spun half-cocked, clicking in the breeze like it couldn't find north anymore. The house itself stood like it had been forgotten by time. 3 stories of timber and stone, shadowed by sagging eaves and shutterless windows that looked out like tired eyes. She stood on the porch before he could call out. Tall, straight-backed, a widow's black dress clinging to her figure like it had grown there over the years. The wind caught the hem just enough to show worn boots beneath the layers. Her hair, more silver than black, was bound into a severe bun, the kind that warned of discipline kept under lock and key. One hand rested on the porch rail. The other, Silas noticed, toyed with a thin gold chain that disappeared into her collar. "You must be Mercer," she called out, her voice even and clipped, like glass polished sharp. He dismounted, brushing dust from his coat, and touched the brim of his hat out of habit more than respect. "Silas Mercer, ma'am, as promised. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. I don't make a habit of running." Her gaze lingered on him, calculating and still. Gray eyes like overcast skies, holding something heavy, but unspoken. "Pete will show you to the bunkhouse," she said at last. "Supper's at 6. We'll speak more then." As if summoned by her words, an older man emerged from the direction of the barn, moving with the steady limp of a man who'd earned it a long time ago and stopped complaining even longer ago. "Jedediah Cole," he said, extending a hand thick with calluses. "Come on, I'll show you your corner of this dying kingdom." They walked without much talk past the barn, big enough to hold a town meeting and as empty as a preacher's promises, and a chicken coop that might have once held hens, but now hosted only shadows. Silas caught sight of cattle dotting the hills like rusted coins scattered across a field. "Not many left," he murmured. "Used to run 300 head, Jedediah said. Now it's barely 30. Drought's taken its share. Coyotes the rest. That, and grief." The bunkhouse was long and low, more dust than roof. Inside, the air was still and sour with age. Empty bunks lined the walls, the frames scarred with initials, ghosted with the smell of tobacco and wet wool. "You'll be the only one sleeping here," Jedediah said. "Been years since we had more than 2 men working this place." Silas chose a bed near the window, dropped his saddlebag. The silver dollar clicked quietly as he set it on the nightstand, like it approved of the silence. "Pete, what happened to the others?" Jedediah leaned against the frame of the door, arms crossed. "Some left. Some got spooked. One went out at dusk and never came back. Maybe it's the land. Maybe it's the lady. Maybe it's the ghosts. I stopped asking." They stood in silence for a breath. Then the supper bell rang, sharp, hollow, and lonely. Martha Bell was already pouring stew when Silas stepped into the kitchen. The house, cold and formal on the outside, held warmth within. A hearth crackling, a table long enough for 12, but set for 4. Her hands were dusted with flour and cracked with years of care. "Sit, Mr. Mercer. You look half-starved." He sat. Jedediah followed. Lavinia Harlow entered a moment later, changed from her work dress to something older, more formal, but still black as mourning lace. She took the head of the table without asking. They ate quietly, the sound of spoons and bowls louder than conversation, until she spoke. "Pete tells me you've got military experience." "Some." "Cavalry?" He nodded. "Good. This place needs someone who understands hard work and harder choices." The last man thought ranching meant sitting under a tree with a tin cup and a dog. Silas glanced toward Jedediah and Martha, who said nothing. Their eyes said enough. "I can mend fences, pull calves, and fix machines that shouldn't run, but still do. What exactly do you need?" She paused, setting down her spoon. Her fingers drifted to the chain at her neck. That same flicker of grief passed through her expression, then vanished. "Everything," she said. "The land's been falling apart. The cattle are sickly. The roof leaks. I'm one bad season from having nothing left to lose." He thought about the men he'd seen in trenches, clinging to rifles and prayers, the way they looked at him after orders were given. "I'll do what I can," he said. That night, he couldn't sleep. The bed was narrow. The night was long. The wind whispered secrets through the cracked window frame. Restless, Silas pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The moon rode high, a silver coin in a black sky. He wandered. The ranch slept around him, groaning in the wind like it remembered better years. Then he saw her. Lavinia, in a black shawl, walking uphill toward the ruins. Slow, steady, like she was following a path she'd walked every night for years. Silas followed, silent. The cabin had once been a home. Now it was just stone bones and a broken chimney, standing like a monument to failure. Wildflowers pushed through the ashes, brave and foolish. Lavinia knelt near what might have once been a hearth. Her voice floated in the wind, soft and broken. "I'm trying, James. I swear I am. But I don't know how to do it alone." Silas stood in the shadows, hat in hand. Her sobs came next, raw, shuddering, not meant for any audience. But he stayed. He knew that sound, had heard it intense, over dead sons, broken fathers. He knew when silence was cowardice. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She didn't move, but her voice came low and ragged. "How long you been standing there?" "Long enough to understand, not long enough to judge." She rose, brushed ashes from her skirt. 3 years, since the fire, since I buried them both." He didn't speak. There was nothing to say to that. "I come here every night, not because I expect them back, just because I don't know where else to carry the weight." "Maybe you don't let them go," Silas said softly. "Maybe you just learn how to carry them different." She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment the steel in her spine gave way to something softer. "You speak like a man, with ghosts of his own." "We all do," he replied. "It's what we do with them that matters." They walked back to the house in silence, the moonlight their only witness. As he reached the bunkhouse door, he paused, turning the silver dollar over in his hand. It felt heavier than before, not with burden, but with purpose. He was beginning to suspect he hadn't just come to Cinder Valley to earn wages or escape memory. Maybe, just maybe, he'd come to help someone else remember how to live again. But even as he lay down and the coyote howls echoed in the hills, one thought gnawed at him. What kind of woman walks into fire and keeps walking after the flames? He'd seen her sorrow. Tomorrow, he'd start to learn her strength. He watches her kneel in the ashes, speaking to no one, or someone long gone, and he wonders, what kind of grief brings a woman to ruins night after night? Some wounds don't bleed anymore. They whisper, in dreams and old chimneys, and the way a woman touches a locked drawer. The desert woke slowly, as if it too carried memories too heavy to rise with ease. Pale light crept over the ridgeline, spilling across the valley in long streaks of gold and sorrow. Silas Mercer sat alone on the bunkhouse steps, elbows resting on his knees. A mug of bitter black coffee cooling in his hands. He had not slept, not truly. The images of Lavinia kneeling among ashes had rooted themselves deep, and his mind gnawed at them all night like a coyote, with a bone it couldn't crack. He watched the smoke curl from the ranch chimney, soft and steady, as if trying to deny there'd ever been another fire, one that hadn't ended with warm bread and comfort. The sound of boots on gravel drew his gaze to Jedediah, who walked with his usual limp, carrying a saddle blanket slung over his shoulder and a toolbox in hand. "You don't sleep much either," Silas muttered. Jedediah grunted. "Sleepin' is for men who ain't got memories." That Silas couldn't argue with. They saddled up by 7, after a quiet breakfast where Lavinia sat with her back straight, eyes shadowed, but clear. She didn't mention the night before. Neither did he. Some things, especially in the West, didn't need repeating. The telling was in the silence. The morning's work took them down the western fence line, a stretch of pasture where time had chewed the posts to splinters and wire sagged like sorrow. They rode in companionable quiet, fixing what could be fixed, replacing what couldn't. The sun had not yet grown cruel, and the scent of sage lingered in the air. "You ever seen fence wood split like this?" Silas asked, squinting at a post that bore jagged scars, deep, angry gouges. Jedediah dismounted and ran a hand over it. "Not wind. Not where. That's from bullets." Silas crouched, fingers tracing the groove. "Old? Old enough not to be fresh, but not ancient either. Someone shot this post like it meant something." They said little after that, but Silas felt the hairs on his neck stand up. The land held secrets. Most did, but this one seemed to breathe with them. That evening, back at the ranch, the light softened. It fell through the west-facing windows in strips, bathing the parlor in hues of honey and rust. Lavinia stood in the sitting room when Silas passed by, staring at a portrait above the fireplace. 2 figures stared back. One, a broad-shouldered man with intelligent eyes and the hint of a lopsided smile. The other, a boy no more than 9, clutching a carved wooden horse. "My husband and son," she said without turning. "James and Billy." Silas nodded slowly. Strong eyes. "Same ones you have." "I don't see them when I look in the mirror. I see what I lost." She turned then, finally meeting his gaze. No challenge in it, just quiet truth. "I used to be softer," she said, "before the fire." "What happened?" His voice came low, not prying, just offering space. "Winter storm," she said. 3 years ago. We'd been snowed in for days. James went out to check the lines, make sure the wires hadn't frozen. Took Billy with him. Said the boy needed to learn how men worked in hard times. She sat down slowly, as though gravity was stronger in this room. A lightning strike. That's what they think. The shed caught. James carried Billy back toward the house, but the wind. The wind! Her voice caught like thorns in fabric. The fire ran faster than they could. I ran out barefoot, screaming. The cold bit my hands, but I didn't care. By the time I found them... She stopped, staring into the fire that wasn't there. Billy was already gone. James told me to run. I didn't listen. Silas sat on the edge of a nearby chair, hat in hand. I dragged them both to the cabin, used everything I had to put out the flames. My hands. They never healed right. She flexed them once, scars peeking from under her sleeves. The doctor said I should have died from the smoke, but I didn't. Guess I was too stubborn. They were lucky to have you, Silas said. No, she whispered. They were cursed to love a woman the fire wouldn't take. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters gently. Silas stared into the hearth. I lost men, he said. Not family, but men I rode with. Good men. On orders I gave. Orders I followed. Doesn't matter. Either way, they didn't come back. Their eyes met again. For the first time, there was no wall between them, just the shared understanding of what it meant to carry grief like a saddle that never came off. Later, after supper, Silas returned to the ruins on the ridge. This time, he walked openly, boots crunching dry soil, making no effort to hide. Lavinia stood there already, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She didn't look at him. I knew you'd come, she said. Not to spy, he said. Just couldn't sleep. She nodded. You don't have to talk. Just stand, if you like, or sit, or remember someone of your own. Silas did sit, beside the crumbling wall that had once been the cabin's front face. He ran his fingers along the stone, feeling the warmth the day's sun had left behind. I remember my friend Elijah, he said. Tall man. Laughed like a church bell. Died in a ravine trying to save a family caught between two regiments. He didn't hesitate, just rode in. Lavinia knelt again by the blackened hearth. You sound like him. I ran once, Silas admitted. I didn't always stand. Then you understand what it feels like to stay. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a folded handkerchief, embroidered, frayed at the edges. She laid it on the ashes. It was Billy's. He dropped it running home once. James picked it up, tucked it into his pocket. I found it in the rubble. They sat like that for a while, two shapes in the twilight, bound not by duty or debt, but by the ache of what they'd lost. Back at the bunkhouse, Silas removed his coat and sat on the cot, holding the silver dollar. Its surface caught the firelight from his lantern, the engraving worn but legible. His father had given it to him on the day he enlisted. This is your compass now. When you're lost, flip it. One side for duty, one side for heart. He'd flipped it the day he'd chosen to disobey a direct order. The side that landed up that day, heart. He flipped it now. It landed in his palm, duty, and for once he felt both sides might lead to the same place. The next morning, Lavinia stood by the barn with Jedediah, pointing out a stretch of the northern pasture. That's where James planned to expand, she said, almost absently. He believed the land could still bloom. Then maybe it still can, Silas said, stepping beside her. She glanced sideways at him, then gave a single nod. I'll show you the blueprints tomorrow. They moved to separate tasks, but something lingered between them, something wordless but heavy with meaning. At dusk, when Martha called them in for supper, Silas noticed Lavinia paused at the door. She looked back toward the hill, where the last rays of sun caught on the crumbled chimney like a monument. She turned back to him. You ever lose someone and wonder if the best part of you burned with them? Silas took a breath, looked out across the valley, and let the silence hang like prayer. Then he said, Every day. I've lost men, orders I didn't follow, orders I did. Either way, they died. Silas's voice breaks in the moonlight. Lavinia just nods and says, Then maybe you understand why I don't sleep. The West doesn't send warnings. It sends dust first, and men second. 3 days passed without a cloud in the sky, the sun hanging motionless like a coin nailed to wood. Each dawn peeled itself from the mountains with reluctant light, and each evening folded in with the hush of coyotes and the occasional snap of a dry branch under hoof. Cinder Valley held its breath. But Silas Mercer felt the shift in the air the way an old war horse senses battle before the horn sounds. Something was coming. He worked harder than he needed to. Fence repairs, trough clearing, shoveling out the lower stalls in the barn, though no one had asked. It wasn't the labor that gnawed at him. It was the stillness between the chores. Jedediah kept to his routine, saying little, whistling under his breath when the sun was low. But there was a tightness in the old man's shoulders that hadn't been there before. Even the chickens had gone quieter, as if they too felt the tremble in the earth. On the fourth morning, the wind changed. It carried with it a smell that Silas hadn't tasted since the southern hills of New Mexico, a sour mix of oil, sweat, and a hint of gunpowder. He stood by the back corral, wiping dust from his brow when he saw it. A small column of smoke curling in the far distance, just beyond the ridge where the canyon met the narrow creek bend. He lowered his hand slowly, tightened his grip on the shovel, then turned toward the house. Lavinia stood on the porch already, one hand shielding her eyes, the other gripping the chain at her throat like it might choke her. "You see it?" he asked. She nodded. "Campfire? Not one of ours. Not the hunters either. Too early in the season. You expecting visitors? Only the kind I wish wouldn't come." That afternoon, she asked him into the study. It was a somber room, made heavier by the fact that it hadn't been opened in some time. The curtains were drawn. A thick film of dust coated the ledger books. A globe sat tilted on its axis, cracked along the equator. She moved with care, like someone touching the bones of a body that hadn't been buried properly. Silas followed her to the desk. She unlocked the middle drawer and withdrew a folder sealed with a red ribbon. She didn't look at him when she spoke. 2 years ago, a land acquisition firm came to Dry Creek Wells. They called themselves Silverton Horizons Limited, said they were exploring mineral rights, offered me a price 3 times the market value for this land. Silas said nothing. "I refused," she continued. "James believed in keeping the land pure. Said some things weren't meant to be mined or measured. That was his way. They came back twice more. The second time, they brought a lawyer. The third time, they just watched. Sat out on the ridge in a wagon for 3 days. Never said a word." She handed him the folder. Inside, forged maps, correspondence stamped with a seal he didn't recognize, and a geological report that, to Silas's trained eye, was barely stitched together. "This isn't real," he muttered. "These numbers are copied. These surveys, they're years out of date. This is a bluff." She nodded slowly. "A bluff backed by more money than I can sue." He looked up. "You think they're coming back?" "I think they never left." That evening, Silas rode out past the ridge, just enough to scout. The smoke was gone now, but he found traces, boot prints too deep for a single rider, flattened brush where a wagon had turned. When he returned, he found Jedediah waiting by the gate. "You've been out sniffing the wind," the old man said. "I smelled trouble." "It smells like sweat and cigar ash, don't it?" Silas nodded. "You recognize the prints?" "Some." "The big ones belong to Pike." "Pike?" Jedediah spit in the dust. "Foreman for Silverton Horizons. Ex-military, I reckon. Walks like a man used to command. Talks like a man who shouldn't." "What's he want?" "Same thing all men with soft hands want out here." "What ain't theirs?" The next day, Silas and Lavinia made the ride together, out to the boundary marker where her property met the canyon. She hadn't ridden far in months, but she sat her horse with practiced grace, even if her hands twitched against the reins. They dismounted beneath a leaning cottonwood. The land there was jagged, scarred by years of erosion and misuse. But it held a quiet beauty too, a kind of defiance. "This spot," she said softly. "James used to call it the spine of the valley. Said if you broke this place, the rest would fold." Silas crouched, brushing aside a tuft of dry grass. Beneath it, barely visible, lay a metal stake pounded deep into the earth, marked with a red ribbon. "Recent," he muttered. She swallowed hard. "They've started without me." As they turned to go, they heard it. Hooves in the distance. Not the easy rhythm of a ranch hand, but the thunder of too many riders at once, too fast for courtesy. Silas grabbed her elbow and pulled her into the shadow of the rock. From their hiding place, they saw them. 4 men, all armed, riding hard. The lead rider was a tall man with a dark hat pulled low, a red bandana tied around his neck. "Pike," Lavinia whispered. Silas didn't answer. He was too busy memorizing their faces. The men rode past without stopping, but they didn't ride aimless. They followed the ridgeline, scanning the hills as if taking measure. When they were gone, Lavinia turned to him. "They're preparing for something." He looked out at the land, the brittle grass, the exposed stakes, the old bones of a ranch barely holding on. "So are we." That night, over stew and cornbread, Lavinia laid a letter on the table. The envelope was torn, the ink faded. "It's from Colonel Thaddeus Crane," she said. "James served under him. The colonel's a man of principle. Retired now, but still carries weight back east. He offered to help once, when the pressure got heavy. Said to call if the law ever turned crooked." Silas picked up the letter. "You trust him?" "He's the only man James ever followed without question." "Then write him again." "I already did." She rose, disappearing into the hall, returned with a fresh letter in hand. "I sent this yesterday," she said. "I think I knew the smoke would come." They stood there a moment, the firelight throwing soft shadows across her face. The silver chain at her neck caught the glow, flashing briefly before disappearing beneath fabric. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the silver dollar, turned it once in his palm. "When I was a boy," he said, "my father told me the West wasn't one with guns or gold. It was one with patience and men who knew when to stand still." Lavinia looked at him, calm but certain. "Then it's time we stood." He nodded. Then came the knock. Not the knock of a neighbor or the soft tap of a rider seeking shelter. It was a hard, deliberate thud. 3 raps, meant to be heard, meant to unnerve. Silas moved first, hand to his sidearm. Lavinia opened the door. There on the porch stood the tall man with the red bandana. Behind him, 2 riders lingered near the gate. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Pike. I believe we've business." "Name's Pike," the tall man said, "and I believe we've business." Some truths travel slow, like cavalry over broken ground, but when they arrive, they carry the weight of justice in their saddlebag. By dawn, the front porch still carried the echo of Pike's boots. The man had left without raising a hand, but his words had lingered like heat from a dying campfire, unseen, but capable of blistering. "We're expanding operations," Pike had said plainly, eyes flicking past Lavinia toward the distant hills. "Company lines say your land ain't properly filed in the current district office. Old claims get dusty. We're here to clean 'em up." Silas had stepped between them, his voice flat. "And if she refuses?" Pike smiled. "Then we just wait. Dust clears on its own." He hadn't said more. He didn't need to. Men like that knew how to speak without raising their voice. The same way snakes didn't need to rattle every time to strike. Now, with the sun only halfway above the horizon, Silas sat by the barn sharpening a broken blade, not for use, but to feel the rasp of steel on stone. It steadied him, gave rhythm to a day that had already started uneasy. Inside the house, Lavinia paced. She hadn't slept. She'd told Martha she wasn't hungry, but the kettle still boiled on the stove, and the scent of black coffee wound its way through the floorboards, like morning fog. By mid-morning, she stood before her father's old roll-top desk, a single blank telegram form spread open before her, and a steel-nib pen trembling in her hand. Jedediah leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like a man watching a fuse, burning slow. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm out of time to be unsure." Jedediah nodded. "Then write it." And she did. To Colonel Thaddeus Crane, stop immediate aid, requested Cinder Valley Ranch. Stop disputed claim. Stop Mercer, Silas present. Stop threat of unlawful seizure. Stop come with truth, stop come soon, stop. Lavinia Harlow, by noon. Silas had ridden her into Dry Creek Wells himself, the telegram form folded carefully in his vest pocket. The ride was long and brittle under the summer sun. The land stretched out like a tired quilt, stitched with dry gullies and split-rail fences. Every corner familiar yet different since Pike's visit. The telegraph office sat between the blacksmith and the chapel ruins, a squat one-room building that always smelled of ink, metal, and loneliness. Silas dismounted, helped Lavinia down, and stepped inside with her. The operator, a gangly man named Merton, blinked at them behind wire spectacles. "Morning," he drawled. "Weather's holding." "We need this sent fast," Lavinia said, handing him the form. He read it once, then again, more slowly. "Colonel Crane," he murmured, almost whistling. "Ain't heard that name in years." "Will it go through?" she asked. Merton glanced at the wires, the keys, then nodded. "It'll ride the copper by nightfall. Answer might take longer." "Let it take what it needs," she said, turning to go. Back at the ranch, Silas returned to the south perimeter to check the watering lines. Every task felt heavier, as if the air had thickened since Pike's arrival. He caught glimpses of Jedediah moving through the tree line, quiet, but not idle. The next morning, the response came. Merton arrived in a plume of dust, telegram clutched in his hand, like a fuse, lit at both ends. Lavinia opened it with trembling fingers. To Harlow. Stop your message received. Stop Mercer acted with honor. Stop court-martial was protest, not disgrace. Stop I hold proof. Stop I come. Stop 3 days. Stop hold the line. Stop Colonel Thaddeus Crane. She read it twice. Then again, aloud, her voice cracking on the word honor. Silas stood frozen, the paper curling in her hand like bark in a flame. He looked at her. "You believed me." "I did," she said, "but now others will too." Hope is a strange thing. It doesn't come in like a horseman or thunderstorm. It comes quiet, like mist, crawling into the marrow. That night, Silas cleaned his revolver with a gentleness he hadn't shown in years. Lavinia sat by the fire, polishing the brass buttons of James's old cavalry jacket, which had hung untouched for nearly 3 years. Martha baked cornbread without being asked. Jedediah brought in extra firewood even though the evening was warm. There was movement on the ridge that night, just a flicker of light, too far to tell if it was a campfire or a trick of moonlight. But none of them slept. On the second day, Pike returned. This time, he brought 8 men. They didn't ride fast, didn't charge, didn't shout. They rode in formation, like men conducting a patrol. Silas met them at the front gate, a rifle laid across his lap. Pike remained on horseback, reins loose in hand. "You sent word to Crane," he said. It wasn't a question. Silas didn't move. "He's coming," Pike sighed. "Shame." "What's a shame?" Lavinia said from the porch. "Is that you ever thought we'd roll over?" Pike grinned, but his eyes didn't smile. "Laws slow out here, ma'am, and memories fade faster than paper burns." "That's so?" Jedediah said, stepping from the barn with his shotgun slung low. "Funny. I remember every man who's ever threatened this land." The standoff hung heavy for a moment. Then Pike tipped his hat. 3 days, he said. "That's what the wire said, right?" Silas didn't answer. "We'll be watching. Careful you don't trip over your own fences." They rode off, calm as ever, but their message burned hotter than a branding iron. That night, the ranch prepared. Windows were boarded, guns checked, livestock herded into the inner paddocks. Lavinia took a lantern and walked the entire northern boundary alone. When she returned, Silas waited by the porch. "You walked it." She nodded. "James used to say you can't defend what you don't know in the dark." He offered her the silver dollar. She took it, weighed it in her palm. "Which side do you want it to land on?" "Doesn't matter. I already chose." At midnight, Jedediah rode in from the west. His horse foamed at the mouth, eyes wide. "They're not going to wait 3 days," he panted. "Pike's men are in the North Hills. Saddle up. Trouble's coming." You can't stop fire with fire. Not always. Sometimes it's the line you draw in the dirt, the place you swear you won't let it cross. The sky cracked open before dawn, not with thunder, but with heat. A dry wind rose out of the northern flats, stirring dust into long fingers that crawled along the ridge. The sun hadn't yet crested, but the whole ranch was awake. Horses snorted in their stalls. Hens clucked low like they sensed the change, and from the west, the faint echo of hooves broke the hush like a match strike in a powder room. Silas Mercer stood alone in the center yard, every muscle coiled tight beneath his coat. He'd barely slept. The night had brought too many sounds, creaks, snaps, the odd clatter of something shifting that shouldn't have. He held the rifle across his chest like a promise he intended to keep. Inside the house, Lavinia moved with purpose. She wore James's old duster now, the brown one with the frayed collar and missing cuff button. Her hair was pinned, tight, and her eyes held the weight of both grief and defiance. She'd walked every fence line again the night before. And this morning, as she looked down from the window toward the barn, she saw only one thing: a line. Jedediah was already saddling the horses when Silas stepped inside the stable. He looked up, face pale under the barn lamp. "They're coming in 3 clusters," he said. "One from the north, one east, one straight up the center ridge." "How many?" Silas asked. "Too many." Silas took a breath. "You still have that scattergun hidden in the feed sack?" Jedediah grinned for the first time in 2 days. "Ain't nothing more sacred than a lie wrapped in grain." They moved fast. Lavinia had mapped the land in her bones by now, and she knew where the high ground was, where the echo carried, and where the creeks cut just deep enough to disappear into. Silas posted Martha in the hayloft with a scoped rifle and 24 rounds. She hadn't fired since her husband died, but her hands didn't shake when she chambered the first bullet. The plan wasn't to win. It was to hold. As the sun rose in earnest, the first shape appeared on the ridge, a rider in a red bandana, waving a small white kerchief that might have passed for diplomacy in some twisted tongue. Silas mounted up, rode halfway out to meet him. "Pike," he said without needing to ask. The man grinned. "No more telegrams, then?" Silas didn't answer. "We come to settle, not stir trouble," Pike continued. "But if you want trouble, Mercer, you'll find we ain't run short." "Colonel's on his way," Silas said. "He carries papers, names, and firepower of his own." Pike tipped his hat. "Then why are you still standing here like the world's already ended?" Silas turned his horse slowly, rode back toward the house. He didn't answer. Behind the barn, Lavinia knelt in the dust. She held her husband's cavalry saber in both hands, not to use, but to remember. She pressed her forehead against the hilt, whispered something too soft to carry. Then she stood. They made their line in the north pasture. 6 rifles, 3 revolvers, and a double-barrel scattergun. Against 16 riders, it wouldn't hold long, but it only had to hold long enough. The first shots came from the tree line, warning shots, meant to rattle. Martha didn't flinch. Her first bullet took a rider clean off his saddle. The man hit the ground and didn't move. That changed the rhythm. The riders surged forward, and suddenly there was no more waiting, no more talking, just thunder and dirt, and the scream of hooves. Silas fired 3 times before the first rider reached the fence line. Jedediah dropped one with a gut shot, then reloaded fast enough to take down another. Lavinia held her ground beside the watering trough, firing once, twice, then ducking as bullets split the air above her head. The skirmish rolled like a storm, fast, cruel, and unpredictable. 2 of Pike's men broke through the lower fence, but were stopped by a tripwire Jedediah had strung between 2 oak posts. One fell. The other turned and ran. Martha's shots kept the ridge covered, pinning down the 3rd group, but the eastern flank was weak, and they knew it. Lavinia saw them coming, 3 riders cutting around the barn toward the side porch. She ran, boots thudding over hard-packed earth, and reached the corner just as one man dismounted. "Don't!" she shouted. He raised his revolver. She fired first. The kickback knocked her backward, but the man folded where he stood. The other 2 paused, just long enough for Silas to arrive. His horse plowed through them like fury, rifle cracking twice. Silence fell like dust. A riderless horse galloped across the paddock. A chicken screamed. Jedediah emerged limping from behind the woodpile, blood running down his sleeve, but grinning like a madman. "We're not dead yet," he wheezed. Martha waved from the loft. 2 more headed back east. Then came the sound none of them expected. A horn. Not a bugle of war, but something more ceremonial, distant, authoritative. Silas turned toward the hills, and there, in the heat shimmer, rose a black coach pulled by 4 chestnut horses. The U.S. cavalry seal glinted on the door. Behind it rode 6 mounted men in crisp gray coats. The coach stopped near the gate. The door opened. Colonel Thaddeus Crane stepped out. He was older than his legend, shoulders stooped, face carved deep with lines of both wisdom and regret. But his eyes, steel gray, had not dulled with time. He walked through the dust, boots slow and even, and stopped before Silas. "Son," he said. Silas dropped his gaze. "You were right to disobey," Crane said. "They never saw the bodies, but I did." He reached into his coat, withdrew a thick envelope, sealed with the War Department's crest. "Your record. Restored. Fully. With commendation." Silas didn't speak. Couldn't. Lavinia stepped beside him. "You're just in time," she said. Crane nodded, then turned toward the tree line, where Pike stood frozen on horseback, his red bandana fluttering like a wounded flag. "This land belongs to Lavinia Harlow," Crane said loudly, lifting a second folder. "Survey records filed in 1873, notarized, recorded, federal seal intact." Pike didn't move. "You're trespassing," Crane continued. "You and your men have until sundown to vacate the region, or we proceed under federal statute." Pike looked at Silas one last time, then at Lavinia. His jaw clenched. Then he turned and rode away. The valley held still for a long moment. Then, slowly, the wind returned. Silas exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. "I think I'd like to sit down now," he said. And Lavinia, brushing dirt from her sleeve, replied softly, "There's cornbread in the oven." The West doesn't forget, but sometimes, if you listen close enough, it forgives. The days after Pike rode out came quieter than anyone expected. The valley didn't celebrate. There were no fireworks, no parades, just the sound of the wind combing through brittle grass and the horses adjusting again to calm. But it was a better quiet than before. Not heavy, not suspicious, just still, like a land that had been held too long by tension, and now, finally, exhaled. Colonel Thaddeus Crane stayed 2 nights. Not because he had to. His authority had already been more than enough, but because he wanted to see the place James Harlow had died protecting. He walked the land in silence, took his coffee black, and on the morning of his departure, left a leather-bound folder of personal documents on Lavinia's desk, saying only, For your daughter, should she ever wish to know her father's truth. Lavinia didn't weep. She placed the folder in the wooden chest beneath the staircase, next to James's saber, and closed the lid without a word. Grief didn't vanish. It shifted, like fog retreating into the folds of canyon shadow. It would rise again, but not today. Silas didn't ask for thanks. He worked as he always had, methodically, quietly. But something in him had changed. He no longer rose just to labor. He rose because he belonged, not as a hired hand, not as a guest. He knew the land now, its rhythm and silence, its grief and grit, and the land, in its own silent way, seemed to recognize him. On the third morning, Lavinia found him in the east paddock, checking the post where one of Pike's men had splintered the gate during the fight. He was sanding down the jagged wood, humming a slow, tuneless rhythm. "I was thinking," she said, hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat, "about repainting the barn doors, red, like they used to be." He looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun. "Then I suppose we'll need paint." She nodded. "And nails. Maybe more hands. Too. You hiring?" She smiled faintly. "I might be." They walked the pasture together, saying little. At the north fence line, Lavinia paused, staring out toward the hills where Pike had first appeared. The place no longer felt like the edge of something. It felt like the beginning. "He'll come back," she said. "Men like him don't vanish." Silas nodded. "Let him. This land's got roots now. Deep ones." She looked at him then, not with the tired gaze of a widow clinging to the past, but with something steadier. "I was wrong about you," she said. He chuckled. "That makes two of us." "James believed no one could fill his boots," she said. "He was right, but you don't have to wear them to stand your ground." Silas didn't answer, but his eyes said what words wouldn't. By the week's end, the damage had been cleared, the fence mended, the barns reinforced. Jedediah had taken to carving wooden pegs again, sitting cross-legged beneath the back eaves, whittling with a small blade while birds nested in the beams above him. Martha returned to her routines, though her eyes lingered longer on the tree line when she hung laundry, and her rifle stayed above the hearth instead of back in the shed. News of the skirmish had reached Dry Creek Wells, of course. But out here, justice didn't travel on the backs of lawyers or circuit judges. It traveled by word, and sometimes silence did more to protect than any proclamation could. Folks spoke of Lavinia Harlow as someone to respect now, a woman not easily moved. The ranch became less a curiosity and more a landmark, a place you passed with a tip of your hat, knowing not to test its fences. On the fifth night, Lavinia laid a white envelope on the kitchen table. Inside it, the deed to the ranch. Silas sat across from her, watching her hands tremble just slightly as she pushed it forward. "I had the notary ride in this morning," she said. "I've added your name beneath mine. 50-50, if that matters. But if something happens to me—" He shook his head. "Don't do that." "Silas," she said firmly, "let me finish." She swallowed hard. "You protected this land when it wasn't yours. You fought for it like it was. James believed blood built legacy, but I've seen now. It's something quieter. It's earned, not inherited." He picked up the envelope but didn't open it. "I won't leave," he said simply. "I know," she replied. That night, Lavinia sat on the porch with a lantern beside her and a cup of chicory coffee cooling at her feet. The stars had come out, thick and wild across the sky. She heard Silas in the barn, checking gates for the third time. A habit now, more than necessity. From her lap, she lifted a folded scrap of linen, the old handkerchief James had carried during the war. She smoothed it flat, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. "You'd like him," she whispered to no one. Somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried with it the faint jingle of bridles and the far-off hoot of an owl. But no hooves, no threats, just the quiet rhythm of a place still standing. At dawn, Silas found her asleep on the porch, wrapped in the old cavalry blanket. He didn't wake her, just set a fresh cup beside her hand and stepped quietly into the morning. Behind him, a silver dollar sat on the porch rail, reflecting the first light. And high above the valley, a hawk wheeled once and soared westward, toward whatever stories would come next. And so the wind settles once more over Cinder Valley, brushing soft against the old fence rails and whispering through the cottonwoods like a voice too tired to shout, but too proud to ever fall silent. And if you sit long enough on the porch where the lantern light flickers just before dawn, you can still hear the slow creak of the barn door, the shuffle of worn boots against sun-baked dirt, and the echo of voices that never needed to raise themselves to be remembered. For out here, the West doesn't always reward the loudest rider, but it never forgets the one who stood their ground when standing was all that was left. And maybe that's why the hoofprints haven't yet faded from the North Road, or why the porch still holds the faint scent of cornbread and chicory coffee when the wind turns warm near sundown, or why the hawk keeps circling that ridge, loyal to a sky that once watched a woman fold away her husband's handkerchief with trembling hands but unbroken spirit, and a man, once cast out by the very country he bled for, stand tall again, not to make a scene, but simply to mend a post and carry a saddle like dignity never needed permission to return home. And though Pike's shadow once loomed over that ranch, it now dissolves like dust before the storm, replaced by something older and more sacred, the rustle of dry grass touched by forgiveness, the thrum of earth that remembers who walked gently and who rode roughshod, and in the hush that follows, you might recall the weight of a silver dollar left on the porch rail at dawn, or the careful folding of a deed between two names, neither needing to be louder than the other, just true. And that's what stays with you, isn't it? The stillness after the fire. The eyes that didn't blink when justice came riding slow and steady in a black coach drawn by 4 chestnut horses. The slow tightening of a saddle cinch before battle. The sharp breath taken when the first bullet cracked, and the peace that came. Not because everything was healed, but because enough had been named, and no one had to lie anymore. Not about the land, not about the past, not about who deserved what kind of ending. And perhaps that's the lesson you carry now, as twilight stretches over the valley like a quilt stitched from memory and pain and quiet hope. That honor may be buried, but not erased. And justice, though late, walks with purpose. That a forgotten woman can be the one to save a generation of kindness not with force, but by simply keeping the truth alive long enough for someone else to see it. And sometimes that's all truth needs, not belief, not thunder, just one person who refuses to let it go quiet. And if you felt that, even just a little, if something in this tale stirred in your chest like an old letter found in a desk drawer, or a melody hummed on a cold morning before the sun is up, then maybe leave a sign you were here. A quiet nod, a soft word, a shared memory in the comments below, because stories like this aren't made to vanish into dust. They're meant to linger like wildflowers blooming out of the hard-pan soil, fragile but stubborn. And if your heart still knows the value of redemption, of dignity earned not gifted, then stay with us, subscribe to our channel, and come back for the next tale. There's always another firelight waiting, another saddle hanging on the porch, another story to carry home like a letter in your coat pocket, warm and folded, meant for those who still believe the West holds more than silence.